that now before we... Wonderful. Okie doke. So at Vets for Climate Action, we acknowledge and pay respects to our First Nations people, past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks joining us tonight. I live on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, specifically the lands of the Gadigal and Wongal people in the area now known as Glebe. I invite you to share the lands that you're on in the chat. The traditional owners have cared for this country upon which we work and meet for over 60,000 years. Its lands, oceans and rivers, its trees and wildlife. We endorse the Uluru Statement and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. Our First Nations people have long understood the deeply rooted connection between healthy people, healthy animals and healthy country, which ties in really well with the veterinary concept of One Health, an important tenet of our work here at Vets for Climate Action. For those who may not know us yet, Vets for Climate Action is a movement of vets and vet nurses, practices and industry partners across Australia who care deeply about protecting animals, people and the environment from the impacts of climate change. We work to inspire and educate both within the veterinary profession and in the broader community, promoting sustainability and advocating for science-based climate action. At Vets for Climate Action, we believe animals need a voice in the conversation, and we're proud to be that voice. If this work speaks to you, we invite you to get involved and become a member. You can also sign up to receive our newsletter if you're not already engaging with us in that way. So tonight's session will run as follows, but we do have a small change to tonight's lineup. Unfortunately, Dr. Colin Dunlop is unable to join us tonight due to an unexpected personal matter. We wish Colin and his family well and look forward to having him at a future event. We're thrilled, though, to have Dr. Neil Walton join us. But before he presents, I would like to introduce you to Vets for Climate Action's newest partner, GreenPay. So GreenPay, the Australian-owned payments company, specifically designed for those who care about the environment, we've partnered with GreenPay to help practices lead the way in sustainability. GreenPay offers a world-class payment solutions where 50% of the profits fund nature at no extra cost to you. But rather than hearing from me, I'm pleased to introduce Glenn Bartlett, CEO and co-founder of GreenPay. The idea is that every transaction your business processes, every consult, every vaccination, every bag of kibble becomes a direct contribution to conservation. Sorry, too many C's in that one. From protecting sea turtles in North Queensland to restoring rainforest in the Daintree, GreenPay is already funding real on-the-ground environmental work. Customers like Ben & Jerry's and Dry July are on board, and the switch is designed to be painless. Same reliability, competitive pricing, local support, just a better use of where the profits end up. Before GreenPay, Glenn built Albert's Impact Ventures, investing in over 20 startups solving environmental and sustainability challenges. And he spent years helping businesses from startups to multinationals embed sustainability into how they operate and grow. He's here to talk about how your practice can look after more than just the animals that walk in at the door. So over to you, Glenn.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Thanks for the intro. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just going to bring up a very brief presentation that I'll share with you. How's that looking?
Good.
Cool. So, so GreenPay, we think of ourselves as world-class payments with a world-saving mission. We didn't start GreenPay because the world needed another payments company. We started GreenPay for some of the reasons you can see on your screen here. We're really struck by the nature stat there. This is from WWF, where their studies show we've lost 73% of wildlife since 1970. In a world where over that last kind of 55 years, we've seen amazing progress for humanity in terms of disease, reducing diseases, in terms of childhood education and many other things. At the same time, we've seen such a dramatic decline in wildlife. Just before I go on as well, Maddie, who's on screen here, is my co-founder. I forgot to introduce her. Say hi to Maddie. So this is why we started GreenPay, because the scale of these issues are really significant, and we've had a number of conversations with the Biodiversity Council of Australia, who tell us that If we could get about 1% of what kind of equates to the annual budget of Australia dedicated to protecting nature, we could actually protect a lot of the really critical ecosystems and biodiversity in Australia. At the moment, though, instead of 1%, it's about 0.1%, which creates a multi-billion-dollar gap in funding for the environment. The idea of GreenPay is to try our best to close that gap, at least some of that gap to some extent. And really, the only losers in this setup is the big banks and offshore tech companies. So rather than profits flowing to them, they would flow back to nature in our model. When we think about that within the vet context, obviously there's the vet context of the One Health concept and seeing animals, planet, and humans kind of operating as one. And we see that there's a really clear connection between what we're doing and what you're doing as vet professionals. Some of the stats that we've been introduced to really suggest that staff, owners, are keen on understanding the sustainability and other practices that vets are doing. And so we think what GreenPay does is it gives vet clinics the ability to be doing something really positive for nature without having to do anything different in their business, just change the way you're taking payments. Generally speaking, you won't pay more, you'll almost certainly probably pay less, and the experience will be as good, if not better, than what you've currently got. So there's really no skin off anybody's noses here, and it's a direct benefit to the environment. It's not like having to buy carbon credits or something else. So it's very straightforward. Our whole purpose and our mission is to put nature at the center of every transaction. So every time somebody pays, those few cents in the dollar find their way back into Australian biodiversity, not the big banks' coffers. One of the things when we went to set up GreenPay and first conceived of this idea a few years ago, is the first question was, how do we ensure that we do have a world-class payment solution? And you'll note, on the front page that we talked about world-class payment solution first, world-class mission second. And that comes from a belief that both Maddie and I have, that you have to earn the right to have a positive impact on the world. You can't ask for concessions. You can't say, hey, here's our really average system that costs you more to try and do something better. So we set out to make sure that that's absolutely not the case. There's no concession whatsoever. If a vet clinic was to choose GreenPay, you will be indeed taking on the very best technology and at really sharp pricing. And the reason we can offer that is we've partnered with one of the world's largest payment infrastructure partners out of the US, who are around the world. 6 million different customers on their books, and we've been able to leverage their back-end infrastructure, which taps into the likes of Visa and MasterCard, etc. So that enables us to be able to offer this. So you kind of get the security and strength that comes with that back-end infrastructure, and then the purpose and mission that comes with GreenPay on the front end of it. The way we make a difference, and you've probably been wondering how we do make this difference, is we just simply give 50% of our profits to the planet. So it's the exact same model in all intents and purposes as someone like who gives a crap in the toilet paper world. They give it, in their case, to third world sanitation issues. In our case, it's Australian biodiversity and nature. And as many of you on this call will know, the issues we have with climate, the issues we have with nature are all inextricably linked. If we can solve nature and biodiversity, it's about 40% of the solve for climate change. And Australia in itself is one of the kind of worst culprits when it comes to the issues around biodiversity. We have some of the highest mammal extinction rates in the world and all species extinction rates in the world, and highest deforestation. So it's not an over there problem, it's a right here problem, which we're trying to solve. These are some of the brands that are already using us. I think we can see Dr. Caitlin's logo there. Got a zoo on board, a bunch of others in the wildlife space, but also the likes of Ben and Jerry's, Dry July, and the other kind of 50, 60, 70 other customers we brought on in the first year who are brands you wouldn't know. They're the mechanic on the corner, the florists, the wholesaler here, the cafe. Those are all making a difference just by switching over to us. Every little bit really makes a difference. Um, Final piece to talk about is our foundation. So the way we make a difference is the profits that flow out of GreenPay. 50% of those flow into the GreenPay Foundation, and the mandate of that foundation, you can look it up. We're very transparent with it all. Is to focus on the challenges relating to environmental protection, nature, restoration, regeneration, climate change, and then food and circularity within the way we do things. And the vast majority of the funds that flow through will be applied to what we call the here and now issues. It's the ability to save a piece of rich biodiversity that could be perhaps bought and protected and locked up in perpetuity. And we can take that action now, which may well protect certain endangered species. Those are the type of things we're really focused on. And I'll show you some of those examples on the next page. Over time, we also want to invest in solutions because we don't want to always be just kind of trying to solve the problems, like hold back the tide. We also want to try and invest in those long-term solutions. And that's things like, one company we really admire that's using seaweed to make a biodegradable plastic that keeps kind of forever plastics out of the oceans and the environment. So those are the type of things we'd look to evolve into. It's not just Maddie and I that are behind GreenPay. We have a very large technical team and compliance and risk team behind us. And we also have these three real world-class leaders when it comes to conservation in Australia. So Rachel Laurie, who runs Bush Heritage Australia, was previously the head of conservation at WWF. Professor Michelle Leishman, who's one of, I think, the world's most recognised plant ecologists, and Darren Grover, who runs the wildlife conservation on land for WWF. So the three of them help us decide where we can divert funds to have the maximum possible impact. And they're really across a lot of the things that are going on in Australia and where the most pressing issues are. This gives you a sense for some of the things we've supported to date. Purchasing a piece of degraded land, working with Bush Heritage on that, working with a Indigenous group in the Daintree. And this is something that one of our customers that we partner very closely with, Ben and Jerry's, are very passionate about. They also support that same project. Some work with endangered species down in the Great Ocean Road through the Conservation Ecology Centre. And as Stephanie mentioned earlier, we're working with sea turtle populations in North Queensland, and that's led by an Indigenous group up there. So that's a little bit about us. I'll open it up if anybody had any questions, but ultimately our proposition is we enable you to turn your payments processing into a force for good rather than a profit line for the big banks and others.
Thanks so much, Glenn. If you want to learn more or get a quote for your practice, I've put some details in the chat, and you're probably speaking directly with Maddie or Glenn themselves. So that's wonderful. I know, and Caitlin, has logo was on the screen, so I'm not speaking out of turn. But I know she switched over, and they've got modern GreenPay has modern terminals and 24/7 local support. The process is fairly seamless, from what I understand. So if you are looking for a new payment provider, definitely have a look at GreenPay, because making sure your money doing good is a great way to take action. But now for the star of our show, Dr. Neil Walton. Let me just share my screen though before I get too much further, so I can introduce Neil properly. Neil graduated from Liverpool University in the UK, but has spent most of his life in equine practice here in Australia, including 3 years in racetrack practice in Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast before 23 years at Agnes Banks Equine Clinic in Sydney. During his time there, he gained membership of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists in Anaesthesia and Critical Care, and in 2013 fulfilled a long-term ambition to complete a Master of Veterinary Studies in Conservation Medicine at Murdoch University. In 2015, he joined the staff at Charles Sturt University as a lecturer in veterinary anaesthesia. And apart from his anaesthesia interests, he maintains a keen interest in wildlife and conservation issues, as well as clinical equine work. He's also project team lead of the Sustainability Committee within the School of Veterinary Science at Charles Sturt University. And in 2024, Neil was appointed to the New South Wales Veterinary Practitioners Board, representing New South Wales academics in the field of veterinary science. And in 2025, we're delighted that Neil is, since 2025, we're delighted that Neil is sharing his expertise and as an advisory committee member to the Vets for Climate Action Sustainable Equine Futures program being developed by Dr. Caitlin Wood. Neil, over to you.
Thank you for those kind words, Steph. That's good. I'm just going to share my screen if you can all hear me. Hopefully you can. I'm just going
We can.
hopefully this works again. Looks like it is. Everyone happy? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you, Glenn, as well for your introduction there. That was excellent. And Steph for those kind words. I would just like to acknowledge my colleague tonight, Colin Dunlop, not being able to be here, and echo Steph's best wishes for his family and himself. He's probably the real master in the master class tonight, but I'll do my very best. He was going to talk a little bit about a specific problem with anesthesia in hypothermia, and he was going to sort of look at the more sustainable ways of warming our animals up and keeping them warm and preventing hypothermia. Hopefully, he will be able to deliver that at a later date. And I was going to do a largely introductory lecture, which I'm about to do now. So it may be a little bit shorter than the full sort of half an hour or so that we intended to do, but I can talk as well, so we might end up going over a little bit over. So a bit of context, and I originally presented this talk in 2025 at a vet education conference in Townsville. And so I was actually going to take a few slides out of this because they related a little bit to the educational side of things. I'm not able to move my... Why is that not moving? There it is. Sorry. There you go. I was going to take a couple of slides out here when those specifically related to the sort of education side of it, and I thought, well, we're all probably veterinary educators. We all have a role to play, be it, in a more traditional teaching context, such as myself, but as private practitioners, teaching our students, teaching our vet nurses, our vet techs, our interns, and what have you. So I've left it in there as something to sort of keep in the forefront of our minds. But effectively, things changed a little bit in January 2024 when the Australasian Veterinary Board Council introduced a brand new environmental sustainability as a new standard for both clinical practice and program delivery within our veterinary schools. And you can see that there as 4.4. The VEE and its staff demonstrate responsible and environmentally sustainable practice and use of resources. Now, the VEE, for those that aren't as good at working out acronyms as some other people are, there's a lot of them around now. It stands for Veterinary Educational Establishment, which is basically just the vet schools and the various supporting educational apparatus that surrounds them. So it's now not only just an aspiration, it's definitely now an absolute must for the veterinary schools to start incorporating this into their curriculum, into their practices. Now, I've often found fair to say that the climate change and the sustainability spaces can be quite depressing at times. A lot of widely diverging and differing opinions and competing interests. So little progress ever seems to get made. But in this particular area, and I've got the two sort of listed down here in the bottom of this slide, improving patient outcomes while minimizing environmental impact. I think these two are actually largely complementary in many of our common anesthesia settings, especially around the use of volatile agents. Now, anaesthetic gases, as you may remember, come under the category of Scope 1 emissions. In other words, they are those that are produced directly on site. So reducing our use presents a good opportunity to make a small but meaningful difference. There has become now some really good evidence, clarity, and guidance that can be found in the increasingly excellent body of research available both in the human and veterinary anesthesia context. Now, the top left slide is a culmination, an article that was a global consensus among a working group of, I think, about 45 human anesthesia providers that set out some basic standards regarding sustainability anesthesia. But they also, rather importantly, talked about the fact that patient safety should not be compromised by sustainable anesthetic practices. Now, though this is the human context, I think this is something to bear in mind with our veterinary practices, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to be very conscious of patient safety. And I'll sort of talk to a few of the examples of that as we proceed. Perhaps one of the pivotal pieces of research or literature, a perspective article by Jones and West, perhaps really set out the veterinary role, or the role for veterinarians, in particular veterinary anaesthetists, to start looking at environmental sustainability. It was quite a pivotal paper in its time and still very relevant. But that has spawned an awful lot of new papers, this particular one in 2024, that really sort of drill down into a particularly quite common procedure, really sort of drill down to work out what exactly were the most carbon polluting aspects of this particular procedure. So one particular surgical procedure. And interestingly, that it came out not just obviously the normal surgery and anesthesia components of such a surgery, but the things that came to light was in fact that travel, staff travel, patient travel, as well as things like kennel consumables, were actually responsible for over a third of the emissions associated with those surgeries. So literature is getting much more precise about how we can improve things. With that in mind, again, this is a human context graphic. You can see there, just going back from that last slide, that transport, procurement, patient travel, staff travel also feed into the human, as you might well imagine, feed into this human side of things as well. And I know the human and veterinary fields are not absolutely side by side, but you can see there are an awful lot of similarities here. And it's important to probably point out that the general anesthetic agents, although they are have a significant role to play, when you look at all of this graphic, you can see there's a lot of other things at play here that we have to consider. But my target this evening is really looking at those other things, such as the volatile agents, and how we can perhaps start to reduce our reliance on overuse of those particular agents. So let's have a quick look. Have a quick look at these agents. We have one anesthetic gas and three well-known anesthetic vapors, volatile agents. As you can see from the atmospheric characteristics on the left-hand part of that slide, the atmospheric lifetime, the global warming potential, and the carbon dioxide equivalent, you can see there are a couple of really bad outliers, notably nitrous and desflurane. Now, nitrous is probably not used very much anymore I don't really believe it's used very much more in the veterinary field. It still has a role to play in human acute care medicine, analgesia, but I think it's fair to say that nitrous is probably more of a experimental type, research type use now, rather than an active clinical use. But the other three, the desflurane, esflurane, sevoflurane, are still out there in use. But you can see this article and other articles since have tried to describe these characteristics in terms of the equivalence of car driving miles. It's kind of nice way of bringing it into a very much a focus. And you can see there that nitrous oxide and desflurane are literally miles ahead of the competition. So I think the first and foremost we take from this is that where possible, those two agents, we need to sort of very much put them in the back on into the back on the back shelf and use the other two, isoflurane and sevoflurane, which are have much better characteristics. Important to note at this time, and this is where the patient safety comes into it, is that desflurane, isoflurane, and sevoflurane are all very potent pharmacological agents with significant dose-dependent effects on the CNS, cardiovascular, and respiratory systems. And this context, the three of them are relatively similar and there are some subtle nuances between them, but they all effectively are quite strong dose-dependent depressants of all of those things. Um, so it's really the characteristics, the atmospheric characteristics that stand out as marking them as different. But so if we can, in our own clinical context, reduce the amount of those volatile agents, we not only potentially gain with environmental factors, but we can gain in potentially in patient safety, which is that really good association that we want to try and maintain. So I like this little graphic on the left-hand side, taken from the British Journal of Anesthesiology in 2002. It's quite old, but it just shows us the sort of anesthesia, the anesthetic procedures that we have available for us to use, from the very basics of local anesthesia on the left-hand side. That could be very much topical anesthesia or local infiltration, to the regional blocks, the more specific, uh, more more complicated anesthesia, regional anesthesia blocks, using local agents and other agents, opioids in particular, for spinal blocks, epidurals, etc. And then we have what we generally regard as general anesthesia, which can be broken into two major components, being the total reliance on our volatile agents, which was common a number of years ago. Now it's becoming much more balanced with this use of total intravenous anesthesia. And what we're aiming for really is this balanced anesthesia, using our intravenous agents either potentially, if we can, as a total intravenous agent, as a total intravenous procedure, but more commonly we use it a balance of the two. We're using our volatile agents, but in a much smaller amount because we're adding intravenous agents into our protocols, and that is effectively giving us that balanced anesthesia. I actually prefer to think of balanced anesthesia. This is what I tend to try and teach my students. And I like the idea of that regional anesthesia playing into that balanced anesthesia. So we go back to the TPLO surgery that we discussed or talked about a couple of slides back, where we often have a peripheral or a major nerve block together with some sort of PIVA, partial intravenous anesthesia, often an opioid, together backing up our volatile agent. And we can really lower our volatile agent if we're using these combination of multimodal agents. The illustration here is a neat illustration. It looks like this dog it is connected to a circuit, as you can see. It's actually just breathing oxygen spontaneously. It's on, I think, from memory, an alfaxalone CRI. This was a relatively short procedure involving a CT of the chest, the thorax. And it was going to be followed by a endoscopy. So I naturally thought at the time, we don't want our poor medicine specialists breathing in isoflurane fumes when they're doing an endoscopy. So we'll just run this completely on a TIVA, if you like, total intravenous anesthesia, involving alfaxalone in this particular case. Our human counterparts, unfortunately, they have to deal with a lot of things. And I would point out, going back to that last slide, that our human anesthesiologists spend a lot of time in this regional anesthesia field. And you do a hip replacement, knee replacement now in a hospital, and they rely very heavily on the use of spinal anesthesia. With our patients, it becomes a little bit harder to do this. The level of training is perhaps not as, or certainly not as good as yet. It's getting better, and I think we'll start to use a lot more of these regional anesthesia techniques as our level of expertise gets stronger. But obviously, some of our patients make these things very, very difficult. And certainly in the situation of we've got all the various different patient species from the German pointer there to the wire-haired German pointer there to the horse and everything in between, from felines to avian patients to pocket pets to exotic and native wildlife potentially. All of these things present their own issues, and clearly there's no one fit solution to sort all of those things out. That just won't fly. So we have to be very careful about our patient safety, and in terms of animals such as horses and exotic wildlife, human safety as well. This is obviously a CT, same CT as a dog, but obviously a slightly different patient. This animal was also on a total intravenous veterinary anesthesia protocol, involving not just one single agent, but a mixture of agents. What we normally call in equine anesthesia a triple drip, so three components: ketamine and alpha-2 and midazolam. We're basically keeping this animal in that position. You'll see it's also intubated. It is connected to a machine where it's being ventilated with oxygen to maintain to good airway compliance. Now, this procedure in normal situations would last about 45 minutes, and I'd be very comfortable running a TIVA on a horse for around about 60 minutes, maybe a little bit more if I knew things were moving in the right direction. But beyond that, I'll be a bit more cautious. I think we're all aware that the equine mortality and morbidity is much greater in equines than it is in our other companion animals, and unfortunately largely focused on the recovery stage and how well these guys actually stand up and behave. I really do think if we take our TIVAs to the point where we're going beyond about that sort of 70 minutes, we are more likely to start to develop those rough recoveries, which we really don't want to do. And a rough recovery in a small animal is not ideal either, but it's unlikely to be a life-threatening procedure as it is with these big equines. So we have a few little issues to resolve when it comes to how we use TIVAs and how we adapt them to our different species. The future's, in some respects, I talked about it being a depressing scenario sometimes, but there may be help on the way. The future in certain places is looking a little rosy. Bell Equine, big hospital, a huge equine hospital in southern England in the UK. I think it's the first hospital to introduce this volatile capture system. So effectively, the ultimate aim really is to capture our volatiles, recover them, remanufacture, reuse, the classic circular economy, which is really what we're after in all forms of sustainability. Not sure exactly how well this is being. I don't think there's a lot of, even in the human field, this is particularly happy to be corrected here. I'm not exactly sure how well it's been utilized in the human field. Certainly in the veterinary field, its use or its availability is not there yet. And it would be expensive, and only some of the bigger practices or institutions would be able to afford it. But it's certainly something that I think is going to be ongoing. New technology will come along, and I'd like to think it's the way of the future to sort of look ahead to these sorts of technologies. I'm also hoping, as I think I heard Steph mention in the intro, our equine advisory group are hopefully going to offer invitation to Tim Mayer, who's the chief veterinary member of the Bell Equine Group Hospital. Love to get him to do some webinars with us and talk to collaboration and possibly some feedback about how well this system is working for them. It would be really good to hear how this is working on the ground. So looking forward to that if we can get him to talk to us one evening. So this is the future. Really what we're concerned about is what we can do right now. And I call this sort of the low-hanging fruit, if you like. And some of this is pretty obvious, but it perhaps needs to be just reminded what we can do and where we can make a difference at this very basic level. And I've already hinted at we probably avoid the use of those worst offenders, desflurane and nitrous. Um, Clearly, the maintenance of your anesthetic equipment is really important to make sure that you're servicing your vaporizers, you're making sure they're properly calibrated so they're delivering what they're supposed to be delivering, and also looking after your oxygen flow meters and not wasting stuff unnecessarily. Obviously, it goes to say maintenance of circuits to avoid leaks, repair your circuits, replace them. Um, Avoiding mask inductions where possible. That always isn't always possible depending on your context. I have a lot of practices anaesthetize a lot of birds, where and also the use of induction chambers for potentially anaesthetizing wild animals, birds, other small mammals. So there is a caveat to avoiding mask inductions because that may be a requirement when we're doing our avian species, but certainly for our normal companion animal species, let's try and avoid wasteful mask inductions. Not good for the planet, not good for anybody, and not really good for the patient. Um, Important to choose an ideal anesthetic circuit for your particular patient. And I've teaching a lot of vet tech students who are often employed in practices. There's a great variety as to when uh, patients are chosen for either a rebreathing or a non-rebreathing circuit. And it can vary a lot from some animals are still on non-rebreathing circuits up to about 10 kilos, which I think is way too high. Here at the university, and I'm not saying we are the perfect example here, but we try to do all of our animals 4 kilo, all cats potentially, unless they're really, really big cats, on a non-rebreathing system, 4 kilos and less for all our dogs, and anything sort of in that range between 4 and 10, we tend to use a pediatric circuit, a pediatric rebreathing circuit. So we're not using those non-rebreathing circuits. And obviously, anything above the sort of 10 kilos, we're going back to our F pieces or our Y pieces, our normal non-rebreathing circuit. So it would be good if we could sort of get people to perhaps consider developing purchasing some pediatric circuits so they're not using, rebreathing circuits on slightly, what I call slightly larger dogs. And potentially, if you are using a non-rebreathing circuit on a larger animal, sort of 5, 6, 7 kilos, you should be using, in theory, quite high flow rates to stop or to prevent non-rebreathing of CO2. I'm not sure that's always happening, but certainly theoretically, you should be running high flow rates to stop rebreathing. So I would like to think that we can perhaps encourage people to try and swap over some circuits, look at purchasing new ones and adapting their equipment in a better way. With that comes, yeah, again, the use of correct and safe lower oxygen flow rates. And I don't want to push the envelope too far here. We don't want to have animals that are, especially with most people's equipment, getting too low, our oxygen flow rates. We can theoretically get quite low, but we're more here about getting safety and getting them down to a lower level rather than trying to really get into dangerous territory. We want to be safe. So I would rely on just using our well-recognized flow rates, but trying to get them down as quick as we can. Monitoring equipment can really potentially expedite better practice, safety for the patients, but also better environmental practice. In particular, capnography. Now, I haven't got any skin in this game at all. I'm not vouching for this particular product. We just happen to have bought for our teaching hospital a whole bunch of these new monitors where you can see we have pulse oximetry, arterial blood pressure cuffs. We have there an end-tidal CO2 adapter and also a thermometer, a esophageal thermometer there. So we've got a really good multi-parametric monitor that does all of these things. And certainly, if we're using an end-tidal CO2 monitor, we can potentially, especially if we're using these non-rebreathing circuits, we can potentially get our flow rates down to a nice low level without compromising that animal potentially rebreathing CO2. So it's a win-win for safety. It's a win-win for the environment. Having good, up-to-date monitoring equipment. These things don't come cheap. You can also, as I've alluded to in the text there, you can also buy modules to add to these machines that actually measure the agents, measure the anesthetic gases, oxygen, isoflurane. That tells you what's going in and out of the patient. These are really wonderful pieces of equipment, but they're not cheap. But if you are updating, I think simply into the getting new monitors, I would certainly definitely advise upgrading if you haven't already got it, upgrading to some sort of capnography so we can look at getting our flow rates down. So that's what I call sort of the low hanging fruit and stuff that we can all be doing relatively easily, relatively safely, and hopefully without too much more expense. Other practical solutions, and this is becoming quite a popular thing, certainly in the equine side of things. Obviously, ruminant surgery is often being done as a standing procedure or semi-standing procedures, not necessarily on the GA, but certainly horses. It's becoming more common, especially some of our head, neck, dental surgeries in horses where you are literally at eye level with the animal. There's less blood loss. Provided we get our nerve blocks in well, they often stand pretty well. I think it does require really quite good facilities, a degree of significant expertise for those that are doing some of these procedures, so it doesn't become dangerous to the animal and dangerous to the people in the vicinity. But certainly, standing procedures has become, a lot more in vogue, and I think it's something that we should consider where we have all the various parameters that would make it safe. I've already talked a little bit about TIVA, the triple drips in equines. Our colleagues in the field that don't have hospitals often use these things on a regular basis to do their procedures. Again, I would, unlike some of our other species where you might be able to get away with it, I would caution, using these things for too long. Again, around that 70-minute period. Otherwise, we may develop difficult recoveries that may not go as well as we would anticipate. Normally, they get up and down pretty well if the procedures are relatively short. But overall, we should be putting a lot more emphasis on going back to that previous slide of that balanced, multimodal, max-bearing anesthesia. And that goes as far back as including some really good pre-medication, because remember, most of our pre-medication agents, such as acepromazine, our alpha-2s, will all produce a significant max-bearing effect. We then combine some sort of partial intravenous anesthesia, some sort of CRI involving opioids, alpha-2s, whatever you particularly want to choose. There's a lot of alternatives in that space, as well as good local anesthesia techniques, such as the dental blocks shown on the picture here, but also peripheral nerve blocks in our equines and some of those bigger nerve blocks that we describe using in orthopedic surgery in some of our small animals. So a real combination of trying to use all the agents we've got at our disposal and not relying too much on our isoflurane use in particular, or our sevoflurane use, trying to get our usage down, trying to get our max bearing as good as we can get. So those are some of the practical tips. I just want to quickly nip back to the education thing again for a minute, because I think it's important that we do recognize that now this is now a must and not an aspiration within our university curriculum to look at this, to educate our students. I think a lot of the students that are coming up are incredibly over this subject. So that'll be a positive thing. But I still think in this space, from the literature, certainly, the veterinary profession does want to have a lot more of a role, a lot more advocacy around sustainability, but there's still a long way to go, not only in terms of bringing it into the curriculum, but also in continuing education beyond post graduation. There's still a lot of work, I think, a lot of more work that we can be doing to educate ourselves, especially some of the older people like myself, are relatively new to this sort of stuff. we need to keep everybody on board with this. And I think there is really good signs between some of my colleagues and other universities overseas here that that sort of collaboration is starting to occur. A little bit contentious, perhaps, controversial. I do think as veterinarians, we perhaps should again look at some big picture stuff. Um, I'd love to know how many times in a day we operate on patients like the one on the left there to correct very poor genetics. These are all difficult questions. I know they're very popular animals, but really, should we be doing multiple surgeries to correct what is really poor genetics? Um, the questions that need to be asked, and maybe it's not the place for it tonight, but I think keep these things in the foremost of your minds. Certainly in 2003, I think it was, the major yearling sales throughout the Australasia introduced mandatory X-rays of all yearlings, um, to highlight lesions, OCD lesions in particular. And this did prompt an awful lot of probably unnecessary surgeries at the time. I think now the evidence is coming in to show those sorts of surgeries, and I'm guilty as charged here because I was part of this process of x-raying horses when I was in practice and finding lesions and sort of recommending that owners tidied up their x-rays, tidied up their horses so they could be better presented as x-rays at the sales. So these animals were x-rayed as weanlings. They then were x-rayed as yearlings, but obviously prior to the sale, but their lesions had been corrected and tidied up with certification to show that it had been done, to be fair. And certainly I wouldn't doubt the great help it was in identifying major lesions like this one on the right here in the hock of this horse. Clearly this animal would have been better off having that removed. Um, for future performance, for future degenerative joint disease. Clearly, that's a no-brainer. But there was probably a great deal of surgeries done around these early times where surgeries weren't particularly necessary. Now, evidence is coming in quickly, to sort of say which of these surgeries are genuinely useful from a point of view of future performance, welfare, etc., etc., which is good to see. And I think as a veterinary profession, we have to be really aware of this evidence-based information that is constantly coming at us. And the other thing possibly we need to talk about uh, on this ethical side is possibly the overuse and the reliance on lab testing as well. Often in anaesthesia, we sort of reach for a lab test if we're not sure. Not saying we shouldn't be doing lab testing, but again, we have to bear in mind the climate costs around chemicals, the procurement costs, the production, transport cost, disposal are pretty enormous. And I think we have to sort of look at some of these more ethical issues and see how we can make our clinics a lot more sustainable. That is about me done. I think it's about time for any QAs or any questions if anyone has any. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Neil. Absolutely. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Neil, we'll open up
Yep.
the window to everyone who may want to ask a question. Please take yourself off mute, or if you're feeling shy, you can pop your question in the chat and I'll read it out for you.
Can I ask if anybody out there is what they're doing if they're in their own practices? How are they doing those sort of little practical steps? What are they doing in terms of if there are people out there, what are they doing in terms of their cut-off times between using a non-rebreathing circuit and using a rebreathing circuit? What are your criteria? If there anyone out there that's not too shy to say what they're doing, I'd love to know. All too shy.
Yeah, might be.
That's fine.
All good. Well, Neil, you certainly raised some important points, both on the ethical front, but really pleased that you've got that your students have the benefit of your interest in sustainability and desire to make a difference. As you do acknowledge, it can be a little bit depressing, but in the sustainability space, but it can also be incredibly hopeful. And we can see
Yeah.
that with new techniques, new technologies, new opportunities, and people who care, that the future is bright. And certainly at Vets for Climate Action, we do talk about anaesthesia and reducing isoflurane as a really tangible way to make a difference in practice.
Yeah.
We talk about there are four components really in practice that have the biggest impact on your carbon footprint. It's gas, and by gas we mean methane gas, natural gas, I for isoflurane, G for grid energy, and V for vehicles, so gig V. If you just focus on those four components, targeting maybe one at a time, you don't have to do them all at once, but you can really reduce the carbon footprint of your practice. So, and we talk about that in our climate care program. And if anyone's ever spoken with Jeremy Watson, you'll also know that he talks about it. And Caitlin, is embedding these principles in the Sustainable Equine Futures program as well. So yeah, anaesthesia is certainly an opportunity there. Rebecca, did you have a question? You've come off mute.
I did actually. I was just going to wait till you're finished talking. That's all.
No, good.
Thank you, Neil.
Hi, Beck. How
I
you
was
going?
wondering. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Sort of ECU anyway. Have you at Charles Sturt measured like what your potential, or tried to estimate what your potential emissions used to be before you made some of these changes versus what they are
I'm in
now?
yeah, it's a big institute. It's not quite as easy as it is in a sort of small clinic.
No.
But yeah, I am in the process now. I'm taking a long time to get through my Vets for Climate Action modules, but I am trying to measure isoflurane use. Obviously, it's a little bit harder when you've got small animals, large animals, same building, but I'm measuring it. And the modules, it's quite an easy thing to do. You got to fill all your vaporizers up and have a starting point, and then look at what's on the shelves and then what you're purchasing stuff, and ideally do that every 3 months. I think as pointed out in the modules. Yeah, I think with the moment largely, Rebecca, I'm trying to really collect all the information. As Steph just said, our isoflurane use, our car usage, that's a hard thing in a university because our cars are often shared by other parts of, other members
Yeah.
of the
It's
university.
not
It's
just
not
you.
just a
Yeah.
one single use. It's quite tricky. So yeah, I'm sort of diving through all that, hopefully getting close to the end. And then, obviously we're going to be introducing some of our processes as those changes develop. Yeah, good
I
question.
Good. At
I
least you're
was
trying. I mean, trying's the first start.
It
I
is.
was gonna
This is the hardest. This is the most laborious process is just collecting all the data
Mm.
and logging it and having it there, and then you can start to implement some changes. And the university is a tricky thing. You wouldn't believe how long it's taken me just to run down all the power bills and all the different waste disposal. It all goes off into different areas, different
I know.
places.
I totally would. You don't know how long it's tried to. I'm trying
Yeah,
to change the bin setup in the clinical skills lab so we can
yeah,
measure our waste better. So I
yeah. It
totally
is
get
a
how
yeah.
hard
No,
that
I
probably
think.
is.
Yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem for you and me. Yeah.
Yeah.
in
Caitlin.
trying to somewhat pop in there what might be considered a estimate of reductions in a small animal practice. I've got an example of Jeremy Watson's practice, because he has been one who has, I guess, I see. Can I share my screen, Steph?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Let's see here. So we were looking as well at costs and reduction in costs. So through changes in anaesthetic protocols, Jeremy has estimated that he's actually saving approximately $5,000 per year. So I don't have this broken into a carbon dioxide equivalent or an exact volume of isoflurane, because we were trying to look at as well as the business side of it. But he certainly has done the numbers and worked out it is a substantial savings just from they've done a full, I think, change in their pre-med protocols. Certainly been putting a lot of training into their nurses and vets in feeling confident in using low flow anesthetic rates. And then they also put in some big investment in installing oxygen on site, generating their own oxygen on site, and so have found that they've made some savings there. Does that answer a little bit, Rebecca? I know it's not the same university level that you guys were looking at,
No,
but
no, it's just interesting. I'm thinking, yeah, emission savings, financial savings, all of those things are part of a bigger picture. So
absolutely.
thank you.
And I might ask Jeremy we could break that down, because we in our carbon calculator, we look at, okay, let's say your 500 ml bottle of isoflurane, what the carbon dioxide equivalent of that is. So we certainly would be able to break that down and show that reduction there.
Thanks,
Thank
Caitlin.
you.
I'm glad you had those at hand. I was thinking of that info, and I was like, oh, I didn't think to pull it up. So thanks, really appreciate that. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to pose to Neil or anyone else on the screen? No, look, in which case I'll start to wrap things up. But before I let you go, what I would love to do is introduce you to exciting new series that is coming up. The first event will be next Tuesday. So we're launching a brand new initiative, the Sustainable Equine Series. So hosted by Dr. Caitlin Wood, who you just heard from. This will be a new online webinar and discussion panel series designed specifically for equine veterinary teams, presented as part of the Sustainable Equine Futures Initiative. This series is about creating space for open, practical conversation and shared learning around the real-world challenges and opportunities of embedding environmental sustainability into everyday equine practice. Caitlin will open with an update on the Sustainable Equine Futures program, followed by a panel discussion with 3 fantastic guests: Dr. Cameron Collins from Charles Sturt University, Dr. Lidvine Vertigal, the equine internal medicine specialist, and T.S. Merlink, an equine surgery specialist. So that is next Tuesday, 3rd of March, 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time for those of you north, 7 p.m. in New South Wales and Victoria, and 4 p.m. in WA. We really hope to see you there. If you want to scan the QR code, you can register, and I'll also put the link in the chat. And the link in the chat, there's also a link to our survey that we're running at the moment, and we really would love your feedback on this. We really would like as many voices, because we're currently undertaking a strategic review, and we want to make sure that our work here at Vets for Climate Action is genuinely delivering what veterinary professionals need. Your perspective is really important to us, so if you have a few minutes, please complete the survey. If you use the QR code on the screen or the link in the chat, the more voices we hear from, the better that we can shape Vets for Climate Action's future direction. So that brings us to the end of our masterclass. A huge thank you to our presenters. So Glenn at the beginning, talking about our new partner GreenPay, and of course, Dr. Neil Walton. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise. A quick note on our masterclasses is that we're committed to keeping these sessions free so that this important information reaches the people who need it most, and that's you. But if you are in a position to support our work, we do warmly welcome donations, which can help us to continue running programs like this one. So thank you for joining us tonight. We'll see you next time. For our animals, our climate and community, keep making a difference.
Thanks, Steph.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
all.
Neil.
Thank you.
Look at us, perfectly on time.